So how do you define corruption in the first place? I want us to start there. How do you define it, and where are the hotspots in Africa where corruption is mainly taking place?
Well, corruption is traditionally defined as the abuse of public resources and public power for personal gain. That doesn't mean that it only involves the public sector. It always, particularly grand corruption, involves a private sector component as well, but it's the public resources that are the resources that corruption is essentially concerned with.
Mm-hmm. Now, 50 billion being siphoned out of Africa right under our nose, with all financial systems in place, with all leaders in several senior positions. How does that happen?
Well, it's $50 billion note, so it's a huge amount of money. Firstly, I think that not all financial systems are in place in Africa. They are in place in South Africa, and yet I think that there are illegal money flows out of South Africa as well. It happens because the international financial markets are not sufficiently well regulated, and the letter to the open letter to the G20 leaders is precisely about providing for mechanisms that will make it easier to identify where this money is going to, and critically to whom it belongs. The situation at present is that somebody who commits grand corruption in his country has to hide the proceeds, which is often more difficult than committing corruption itself, or it should be. And they usually have to get it offshore. They have to get it into foreign accounts. And so what they do is get it into jurisdictions, particularly often secrecy jurisdictions, but they get it into accounts in which the beneficial owners can't be easily identified. And one of the major demands the letter makes to the G20 leaders is to commit their governments to introducing public registers that identify the beneficial owners of companies and trusts, in order basically to make it easier to detect corruption and reveal the proceeds of corruption.
Mm-hmm. Much as you propose in that they should reveal all the secrecy regarding ownership of trusts, buying of high-end goods like property and jewelry and paintings and so forth, and denial of visas. Is it going to work? Because I'm looking at now the issue of people's rights. They have a right to privacy, they have a right to buy, they have a right to travel. Are you not going to encroach on their basic human rights?
Well, there are difficulties surrounding each of them, and the details have to be worked out. But regarding people's right to buy, people, it's very well established that suspicious transactions have to be reported to a financial regulatory authority. In fact, my understanding in South Africa is that at the moment everybody has to report suspicious transactions which it comes across. Real estate agents most certainly have to report it, and I think that vendors of jewelry have to as well. But the bottom line is that everybody has to support a suspicious transaction. So when you get somebody coming to buy a house in Sandhurst or in a farm in Franschhoek, and they're paying $20, $30, $40 million in cash for the property, you need to ask where that cash comes from. When somebody walks into, as I've heard recently, into a jewelry store in Sandton, and in a transaction taking no more than a minute, spends 1.2 million rand in cash on jewelry, you have got to wonder why this money is so hot that he has to get rid of it so carefully. So yes, there are rights, but there are also signals, if you like.
I've heard of that debate before, where you question why would somebody buy a Lamborghini or a Ferrari within 5 minutes and all that. And when you raise that issue, it will be, come on,
no,
David, you jealous.
We're not worrying about the people who buy the Lamborghini. What we are worrying about is when they buy it for cash. If that transaction goes through a bank, through a credit card, whatever, that's not a worry necessarily. When they buy it for cash, you have got to calculate that this is a person wanting to get rid of the cash. Not necessarily wanting to buy the Lamborghini is not the point. The point is he wants to get rid of cash, and a lot of cash.
But that's one scenario on one hand, but on the other, us will feel you're questioning their integrity, and you're invading on their privacy.
Because we have to act on signals. Mm-hmm. Because it's a good point that you make, but when corruption is committed, one seldom sees the brown envelope changing hands. There's seldom direct witnesses to that, but there are inferences. And there are a range of inferences in tender, fraud, there are inferences. But one of the inferences is that when somebody has a large amount of cash that he is wanting to get rid of on a very, very expensive item, that there is some good reason why he doesn't want to be caught with that cash.
Okay. David, before we end the interview, let me ask you a question about this widespread perception that there are also underhand deals when it comes to tenders being awarded, that other people don't deserve to get them, but they end up getting the business, they get the money, but they don't end up delivering. And also that cascades down to the debate about corruption in governments throughout Africa.
Well, that happens, and I mean, we know disturbingly that it's happening on fairly large scale in South Africa at the moment. That people get paid out. We were just told this morning by one of your fellow journalists of a story of somebody getting a very large contract to build houses, being paid for that, the houses not being delivered. It's not an uncommon story, and there are a variety of ways in which it can be tightened up. And I think that certainly the National Treasury at the moment is very intent on tightening up the procurement rules so as to make it less vulnerable to that kind of conduct. But yes, it happens, and we must deal with it.
All right, just very briefly before you go, the letter. How is it going to be presented to the G20 leaders?
Well, it has been, as I understand it, in the sense that it has gone to all the G20 leaders, and there's probably a mechanism for getting it onto the agenda. I believe that in general, the subject is on the agenda. And, $1 trillion in anybody's language is a lot of money, and we hope that the G20 leaders, especially those, well, the one from Africa, President Zuma, takes this seriously and recognizes what damage it's doing, particularly to developing countries and maybe most particularly to Africa.
Right. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Right. We're talking here to David Lewis, who is Executive Director of Corruption Watch, on the open letter that has been addressed to G20 leaders to end and take drastic measures to end corruption.